What you should know about closing costs. Is down payment included in closing costs? What are closing costs? Did you know that sellers have closing costs too? It's not just buyers. What are the average closing costs percentage? Can closing costs be included in a mortgage? Let's chat about closing costs 411 in today's video. Hi, I'm Charlotte, your local Thurston County real estate broker. Before you buy a home, it's important to plan ahead. While most buyers consider how much they need to have saved for a down payment, many are actually surprised by the fact that they have closing costs they have to pay. This isn't talked about like down payment is, but it's important to know what to expect when it comes to these fees so that you aren't caught off guard when it comes time to close on your home. You need to understand what closing costs are and how much you should budget for. So, what are closing costs? People are sometimes surprised by closing costs because they don't know what they are. According to Bankrate, closing costs are the fees and expenses you must pay before becoming the legal owner of a house, condo, or townhome. Closing costs vary depending on the purchase price of the home and how it's being financed. In other words, closing costs are the collection of fees and payments that are associated with your transaction. According to Freddie Mac, who reports on this at a national level, while they can vary by location and situation, closing costs typically include government recording costs, appraisal fees, credit report fees, lender origination fees, title services, tax service fees, survey fees, attorney fees, underwriting fees, to name a few. They can also include other lender fees like loan application fees and processing fees. There's also daily prepaid interest if you're getting a loan. This is the daily interest rate that you are paying from the time you close until the end of the month. So if you close at the beginning of the month, you're going to have a much higher daily prepaid interest than if you were to close sometime like in the last week of the month. You will also see prorated property taxes and HOA dues. These may be a fee, but they also might be a credit depending on when you close and when they're due and if the seller's already paid them, etc. So those ones, while you may see them, they might actually also be a credit. Also, in some situations, the real estate agent or broker compensation is also listed as a fee. How to estimate closing costs. First, let's talk about the buyer's closing costs. Wait, you didn't know that the seller had closing costs too? Well, they do, and I'll go over that next, but let's cover buyers first. Understanding what closing costs include is important, but knowing what you'll need to budget to cover them is also critical, probably more so. According to the Freddie Mac article mentioned above, typical closing costs are between 2% and 5% of the total purchase price of your home. With that in mind, here's how you can get an idea of what you'll need to cover your closing costs. Now, the state of Washington has an average of 3.8 for closing costs. That's the whole state, and the 2 to 5% is a national average. So if we want to take it a step down and go specifically in Washington, the average closing cost for buyers in Washington is 3.8 for closing costs. So how you calculate the closing costs or estimated closing costs is you take the purchase price of the home and multiply it by the percentage to get an idea of how much you can expect to pay in these closing costs. So let's say you find a home that you want to purchase for the median price of $366,900. Based on the 2 to 5% Freddie Mac estimate, your closing costs should be roughly between $7,500 and $18,500. Now, if you're looking at the Washington average at 3.8%, this would be about $13,945. Now, this average is all dependent on the hyperlocal area which you purchase in, so you'll need to get more accurate numbers or a fees sheet from your lender when you're actually getting pre-approved. That will give you a much more accurate estimate. Could you imagine what a shocker that would be if you weren't prepared? Keep in mind, if you're in the market for a home above or below this price range, your closing costs will be higher or lower. That calculation is based on $366,900, so you have to adjust it accordingly. Another question I get is the down payment included in the closing costs? The answer is technically no. It is not considered a closing cost. However, you will see from the escrow company a closing statement, and on that statement it will show you all of the fees and credits that are associated along with loan information, including down payment that are associated with the transaction. At the bottom of that statement, it will state how much money the buyer will need to bring to the closing table in order to close on the house, and that amount is the sum of the fees, down payment, etc. So it's kind of all rolled in together, but it's technically not a closing cost. Another question that is often asked is, are closing costs tax deductible? We'll definitely talk to your CPA. The short answer is some. The IRS says generally your real estate taxes and home mortgage interest are included in your house payment. If you took out a mortgage or a loan to finance the purchase of your home, you probably have to make monthly house payments. Your house payment may include several costs of owning a home. The only costs you can deduct are state and local real estate taxes actually paid to the taxing authority and interest that qualifies as home mortgage interest and mortgage insurance premiums. Definitely talk to your tax person for more information on this. Are closing costs included in my mortgage? Can closing costs be included in a FHA loan, and can closing costs be included in a conventional loan? Typically, no, closing costs aren't in your mortgage, but they can be. This is very buyer specific and lender specific. So the answer is sort of yes. Technically, closing costs can be included in a mortgage loan, FHA loan, or conventional loan. But you'll definitely want to talk to your lender in depth about this, because some loans won't let you roll in all of the fees. Some lenders won't roll in the fees. So while technically the answer is yes, it's not super common, and there's definitely cons to doing so. One of which is that you will be paying a percentage on those fees for the long run, and therefore your loan is going to cost you more in the end. One last point on closing costs is that they are one of those items that you actually can negotiate on when you're negotiating with the seller on the price of the home. That's one of the many items in the contract that are negotiable. So in this current market, there are more sellers that are paying for some or the majority of the buyer's closing costs. In the last few years, this was definitely not an option, but we are seeing this more and more in this current market. So how often do sellers pay closing costs? Well, when we are talking about the sellers paying the buyer's closing costs, this all depends on the seller, price point, market, etc. I'm going to cover what's the best way to make sure you're prepared at closing time at the end of the video, so be sure to stick around to the end so you can check that out. But now I want to talk about some of the sellers' closing cost fees. So how often do sellers pay closing costs? When we're talking about the seller's own closing costs, well, then every time. Why would a seller pay closing costs? Well, they have costs associated with selling the home. So let's talk about that a bit. First, typically the costs come out of the profit from selling the home. So unless the seller is upside down on their mortgage, meaning they owe more than it's worth and will get from the sale, they don't typically have to bring money to the closing table. If the equity is low and the profit from the sale isn't enough to cover the closing costs, then the seller would actually need to bring cash to the closing table. What is the average closing cost for a seller? The closing costs for a seller can be about 6% to 10%. What are some of the closing costs for sellers? This includes things such as title search, title insurance, property taxes, HOA fees, loan payoff fees, escrow settlement fees, transfer fees, recording fees, mortgage payoff fees, potentially prepayment penalty on a loan, any other outstanding liens or other amounts like utility bills that are owed on a property, usually the real estate compensation, and sometimes seller concessions, like if the seller is going to pay some of the buyer's closing costs, for example. So you can see it's no simple business selling your home. What's the best way to make sure that you're prepared at closing time? Freddie Mac provides great advice for home buyers, saying, as you start your home buying journey, take the time to get a sense of all costs involved, from your down payment to closing costs. When I work with buyers, we talk about this up front when we go through the orientation, and more specifically when we're talking to your lender. Knowing these ahead of time will really help prevent any surprises. As a seller, when we have our initial conversations about what your home is worth, we will go over your net sheet together and build this out so that you'll have a really good idea on what those fees will be and how much you will truly walk away from the closing table with. If you want to have a quick call to go over some of these things in more detail, you can click on the schedule time with me link in the description below. As always, my calls are no pressure. I'm happy to answer any questions you have, and if you decide that buying or selling isn't right for you, no big deal. I hope this was helpful. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.